Hello, this is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague Sydney Derrick, our librarian. This podcast will demystify archives. I am passionate about convincing people that archives are not in any way boring. They are, in fact, incredibly interesting. Who doesn't like to read stories about other people? Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello and welcome to today's podcast. We are going to be talking about a woman today who inspired a group of Americans right here in South Carolina to continue their fight during the Revolution and the ways in which her inspiration still shows up in our lives today. But first, let's get into some announcements. We have two newly processed collections available to researchers in our archives to tell you about. The first is the Stephen R. Wise Papers, which includes research notes and other materials relating to two books authored by Wise about the Civil War, with correspondence about blockade running and naval history, as well as copies of photographs, illustrations, and maps. The second collection is titled Research on Charleston Libraries 1987 to 2006, which includes research by David Heiser on the subject of the Charleston Library Society and other libraries in Charleston from the late 18th century into the earliest 20th century, like the Apprentices and Miners Library Society, the Associated Library Society, the Franklin Library Society, the Mercantile Library Association of Charleston, the Washington Library Society, the YMCA Library, the Ladies Traveling Library Society, and more. We also have a newly digitized collection to tell you about, the Second South Carolina Regiment Order Book from during the Revolutionary War, which includes military orders from numerous generals, information on soldiers accused and punished for crimes, and a list of soldiers who served in the regiment. That's available to view for free online at the Low Country Digital Library's website. And lastly, while you're online, be sure to check out the Historical Society's online gift shop, where you can shop for a ton of South Carolina-themed gifts for someone else or yourself from the comfort of your own home. You can find that at shop.schistory.org. Let's talk about our sources for Susannah's story. We used The Baronies of South Carolina by H.A.M. Smith in the South Carolina Historical and Genealogical Magazine, South Carolina Women by Adela Bodie, Patriots, Pistols, and Petticoats by Walter J. Frazier, AmericanRevolution.org, Report of the South Carolina State Flag Study Committee, a plat from the H.A.M. Smith Papers at the South Carolina Historical Society, an 1802 plat of Hutt Plantation housed at the South Carolina Historical Society, and South Carolina's Fourth Order Regiment book housed at the South Carolina Historical Society. So we have a lot of sources right here in our own archives, which is really what this podcast is all about. For those not familiar with the area, Fort Moultrie stands on Sullivan's Island as one of the first lines of defense in the Charleston Harbor during the American Revolution. In June of 1776, the newly minted Americans found out just how vital that location would be. After an attack from 9 British ships on the unfinished fortification, which was called Fort Sullivan at the time, the South Carolina regiments managed a victory with many fewer casualties than the Redcoats and many fewer fighters than the British as well. It was a very unexpected victory, but one that lives on here in South Carolina memory. A few days after the battle ended, Susannah Smith Elliott was one member of a group who traveled across the harbor from Charleston to thank the men for their valiant efforts. Susannah was in that group because she was married to Bernard Elliott, one of the commanding officers in South Carolina's 4th Regiment. And they were participants in this battle at Fort Sullivan at the time. So, on our 4th Regiment series, which we do about every other episode here on the podcast, we explore the daily order book of this regiment. It's basically a diary or a journal of the daily activities of the men who were part of that regiment. Now, we're not up to the point that we're going to talk about today in that order book on that series. So, just a warning, there are spoilers ahead in case you want to follow their story without knowing what happens. I'm sure most of you know what happens, but just in case you want to be surprised, we are going to talk about what happens later on in the 4th Regiment order book today than we are doing in the actual series. The 4th Regiment was an artillery regiment whose members oversaw weapons on the various forts and batteries in the Charleston area. So let's read a little of their order book from that day. July 1st, 1776. This is the day when the group comes out to congratulate them on their victory. This day, General Lee visited the garrison at Fort Sullivan, and when the regiment there was drawn out with a small detachment of the Corps of Artillery, he at their head returned them his thanks for their gallant defense of the fort against a fleet of 8 men of war and a bomb, including a cannonade of 11 hours and a bombardment of 7 hours. Mrs. Barnard Elliott, the lady of Major Elliott, complimented the 2nd Regiment at the same time with a very elegant pair of colors, delivering the following words to the regiment, who, with rested arms, received them. Your gallant behavior in defense of liberty and your country entitles you to the highest honors. Accept these 2 standards as a reward justly due your regiment, and I make not the least doubt, under heaven's protection, but you will stand by them as long as they can wave in the air of liberty. So, Susannah presented the men of the 2nd Regiment, which was the main regiment assigned to defend Fort Sullivan, 2 flags, one red, one blue, that she embroidered as a thank you for their service. And she delivered them with a pretty moving speech, as you heard just there, about what they were fighting for and how the flags symbolized their cause. So, I mean, she's basically South Carolina's own Betsy Ross, right? One thing to note there is that she is not mentioned by her given name. She's mentioned by her married name, Mrs. Barnard Elliott. And this is something that, if you're doing historical research, it's something to keep in mind, because if you are researching a woman, it's often helpful to search her married name or her husband's name, because a lot of times, even if you're just looking on like newspapers.com, that's who they're listed as, is Mrs. So-and-so instead of Susannah Smith Elliott. Just a little tip there for you. But let's get back to the flags, because these flags and giving them to the 2nd Regiment, that's not where her patriotism begins or ends, and it's not where the story of the flags does either. And don't worry, we're going to come back later in the episode and talk about what the flags looked like, because I know you're all wondering. Susannah Smith was born sometime between the late 1740s and the mid 1750s. She was the daughter of Benjamin Smith and Ann Lawton. Her father was Speaker of the South Carolina House of Assembly from 1755 to 1763, so that's going on while the state was still under British rule. Susannah's mother died when she was a child, and her father died a few years later, so at some point in her childhood, we know that she lived with her aunt, Rebecca Mott, who was a Charleston icon of the Revolution herself, but that's a story for a whole nother episode. On January 4th, 1776, she married Barnard Elliott, becoming his 2nd wife after his first wife died in childbirth. Barnard had served in South Carolina's 2nd Regiment and, as I mentioned earlier, was a major in the 4th Regiment by this point. So when Susannah traveled out to the battlefield to present these flags, she had only been married to Barnard for 6 months. And while she doesn't know it yet, her husband will only live for about 2 more years. So war was the constant backdrop of their life together. There is a separate patriotic story about Susannah while she was living on one of Barnard's plantations. It was sometimes called the Hut, and it was part of an area called Horse Savannah in Colleton County, which is a little further south than Charleston, if you're not familiar. I don't know the original source of this story, so there's a caveat for you. And it has echoes of a story about her aunt, Rebecca Mott. But the story goes that while she had 3 American soldiers visiting her home at the hut, this plantation, several British soldiers unexpectedly came riding up. She hid the 3 American soldiers in a secret area behind her chimney and managed to order her silver to be hidden in the marsh, thus saving it from the British. The enemy soldiers searched the house from top to bottom, but the American soldiers were never found, though in some versions of the story, one of the Americans tried to escape and was killed in his attempt. When the British then accused Susannah of hiding the silver in several mounds of dirt in the yard that they could clearly see, she explained that no, those were actually the bodies of British soldiers who had died at her home. But her interrogators did not believe her, so they dug into the mounds of earth, and upon doing so, the British found she was telling the truth. They found a coffin, which they opened and saw the body of a fellow Brit. Again, I don't know if that story is 100% accurate because I cannot find an original source, but we do know that Susannah lived on a plantation known as the Hut. In his will, Barnard Elliott's father left him a Colleton County plantation in an area called Horse Savannah, and Barnard eventually bought the land next to it, which was often referred to as the Hut. Barnard eventually dies in 1778, and in 1792, Susannah purchases the plantation using her new married name, Mrs. Susannah Carnes. In addition to having the record of her purchase recorded, we also know she lived there because her name is reflected on an 1802 plat of the property that's in our archives. Her second husband was Captain Patrick Carnes, who also fought in the Revolutionary War, and he died in 1786. So by the time of her purchase of this land in 1792, Susannah was a widow again, and this may be the reason she was able to buy the property in her own name. That typically wasn't something that women were allowed to do unless they were widowed. But we'll get back to the flags again. After gifting them to the 2nd Regiment, the next time they pop up in the historical record is 2 years later. They make an appearance at Barnard Elliott's funeral on October 27th, 1778, and this is recorded in the order book of John Grimke. According to the order book, the flags were carried by the Grenadier Company of the 2nd Regiment while they were marching in procession through the city of Charleston, and the procession was large. It included several regiments as well as members at the highest level of government and military. It began at Elliott's home, where his body was brought out, and ended at the graveyard of St. Philip's Church. So back in 1776, when Susannah first gave these flags to the 2nd Regiment, they were honored by the gesture, and they vowed to honor the flags as well. They continued to fight under them through the next few years, and during the Siege of Savannah in 1779, Sergeant William Jasper and Lieutenant John Bush made this task of honoring them their final one. The flags were planted in the ground by the 2nd Regiment during the battle, but these 2 men were shot down in their attempts to keep them flying. It's reported that Sergeant Jasper's final words were, "Tell Mrs. Elliott I lost my life supporting the colors she presented to our regiment." Sergeant Jasper had also spent time defending a flag during the Battle of Fort Moultrie, the battle that led Susannah to make these 2 flags in the first place. Jasper made it his mission during that battle to keep the flag designed by Colonel William Moultrie, which became a major source of inspiration for today's state flag, flying during that battle, inspiring the troops around him to keep fighting. So Jasper really has a thing for flags, and he may be a future podcast topic. Now, the flag he was protecting during that battle, the Battle of Fort Moultrie, you've probably seen before. It's got the dark indigo/navy blue background. It's got the shape, the crescent shape on it, much like our state flag today. But instead of a palmetto tree, it just has the words Liberty in kind of block capital letters. So a very similar flag to the South Carolina state flag today. And the color was also very similar to the blue flag that Susannah made. And we'll talk a little bit more about the design of the flags that Susannah made here in just a minute. Unfortunately, both Susannah's blue flag and the city of Savannah ended up falling that year in 1779. The flag was captured and taken back to England eventually, potentially spending some time in the Tower of London. Her red flag may have been later captured at the Siege of Charleston, but no whereabouts are known for that one. By the early 20th century, the blue flag was in a museum in Winchester, England, and in 1989 it was purchased jointly by the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of American History and the South Carolina State Museum, and it has been displayed at both institutions. So we're going to include a picture of it on our social media so you can check that out. But now we're going to describe what these two flags looked like. The two flags reportedly featured the same design. So here's a description of the blue one, since that's the one that we actually have an image of and we know exactly what it looks like. At the top left, she embroidered the words 2nd Regiment, with 2nd represented in Roman numerals and the word regiment abbreviated. In the center of the flag was a wreath of leaves, possibly olive branches, around a drum and two crossed flags. On the drum, there is also a crescent moon symbol, much like in the flag that was flying at the Battle of Fort Moultrie. There are also some words on this flag, though these words are not reflected in the object examination report that was completed by the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. She reportedly embroidered the Latin words for liberty is to be more desired than life. So that sentiment went along well with the speech that she gave when she presented the flags to the men of the 2nd Regiment. And it also is a good reflection, I think, for the ethos of the American Revolution. Skipping ahead a few years and bringing it all the way up to the year 2020, Susannah's flag was used by the South Carolina State Flag Study Committee to inform the design of a standardized state flag. I'm not sure that everybody's aware that although the South Carolina state flag is quite iconic with the crescent shape and the palmetto tree in the center, there is no standard look for the actual color, background color of the flag. There's no standard look for how the palmetto tree should look. There's no standard for how the crescent should be placed, sort of at which angle it should be placed. Back in 2020, there was a study committee that formed to try and make a standardized design for our state flag so that they would all look the same in whatever capacity the flag was being produced in. Susannah's flag features several symbols in the middle, including that drum with the crescent shape on it, and the committee cited that this was possibly the earliest surviving example of that crescent symbol because the flag that flew at the Battle of Fort Moultrie is no longer in existence. And the committee said it also might be the earliest surviving example of the blue color of the flag, which the committee had tested so that it could be reproduced for the state flag. However, the committee's design was not approved, so there is still no official standard state flag. All the palmetto trees, crescent sizes, and colors do vary slightly in design from manufacturer to manufacturer. The push for the standard did come up again at the beginning of 2023's legislative session, so it may one day happen, and we can count Susannah and her flags as part of the inspiration. And as we get closer to the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, it's really fun to look back on these stories. Some are well known, some are not, but to look back and see how events from seemingly so long ago still resonate and still have an impact on our lives today, and how we're still talking about the things that people did 250 years ago. So that's going to wrap up today's podcast episode. We'll be back next month with another episode in our series from the 4th Regiment Order Book. So we'll talk about where they are, where they go next, how long they stay at Fort Johnson in the Charleston Harbor. Do they ever make it back to the city of Charleston? We'll have to wait and see. But thanks so much for joining us here on today's episode. We're always available online at schistory.org. And of course, you can visit our museum at 100 Meeting Street in the Fireproof Building in Charleston, South Carolina, and our archives inside at the College of Charleston's Addlestone Library on the 3rd floor in the Special Collections Reading Room. And you can follow us on Instagram and Facebook to hear about the latest events and happenings at the museum and to get a peek into what we hold in our archives. We'll see you soon.